Then we have iteration constructs. Iteration constructs, as you see, are built on multiple blocks. There is a condition block. This is also known as termination condition. As long as this termination condition evaluates as true, we stay in the loop. As soon as it evaluates as false, we exit the loop. And the loop has a body. The body is basically the behavior at each iteration. So a loop means that we execute this body a certain number of times, typically on different values. So an example would be that we have a vector, an array, with n elements from 0 to n minus 1, and then we execute this body, whatever operation it is, on each element. So what typically happens is that the termination condition is based on some counter of some sort that essentially tells us how many times this body needs to be executed. And so typically what happens, this is not always true, but typically in a loop you would have that the counter gets initialized. So you would have this initialization of the counter before entering the loop, a condition based on the counter, on the value of the counter, and then as the last thing before moving on, like as the last operation of the body, you would have that this counter is somewhat incremented to move to the next item. So again, here I'm generalizing because we're using this example of array, and this happens very often. But there is other kinds of conditions that don't involve a counter, might involve the data itself. As soon as you increment this data, then you quit when the data reaches a certain value. So this is not always true. What it is pretty true, though, is that before entering the loop, there is something that initializes something. And that will be used in the condition. So there is very often, almost always, something initialized before entering the loop. And that something has to do with the condition. And then there is some way of evolving to keep track of the fact that this is executing. And this also has to do with the condition. Something needs to change at every iteration for this condition to eventually return false if it returns true at the beginning, so that we can exit the loop. Otherwise, we stay in an infinite loop. So the basics of the loop are those. Now, there is two kinds of loops. One is the while loop, and one is the do while loop. As you see, they are very similar. They both have conditions. They both execute a body. They both exit when the condition is false and keep iterating a certain number of times. What is the main difference that this kind of rearranging the blocks would bring between the two loops? What is the main difference between a while and a do while? Right, the difference in the order between condition and body. And so at the end, the net result is that in a do while loop, the body is executed at least once. Okay? So they're kind of equivalent, but if you cannot afford to execute the body at least once, then while loop is a better choice. If there is a requirement that the body should be executed at least once, because maybe the initialization is there in the body now, for whatever reason, then the do while is a better choice. So there is basically a trade-off that has to do with whether we need or we cannot execute the body at least once.